But we do want to turn now to our top political story of the day, and it's something that we've never seen in modern politics. A lame duck president with an approval rating in the 30s, with his party bracing for a bruising midterms, have such an iron grip over his party. But over the weekend, President Trump got his revenge against another Republican who crossed him, and it was a big one. An incumbent senator in Louisiana, Senator Bill Cassidy, who was defeated in the Republican primary, with State Treasurer John Fleming and Trump-endorsed Congresswoman Julia Letlow both advancing to a June runoff without him. On social media, the president cheering Cassidy's loss, accusing him of disloyalty and referencing the senator's vote to convict him in his 2021 impeachment trial. Now, Cassidy did not mention the president by name in his concession speech, but he seemed to reference the president throughout his remarks.
Our country is not about one individual. It is about the welfare of all Americans, and it is about our Constitution. And it is the welfare of my people and my state and my country and our Constitution to which I am loyal. And if someone doesn't understand that and attempts to control others through using the levers of power, they're about serving themselves. They're not about serving us. And that person is not qualified to be a leader.
Cassidy's loss is just the latest example of the president devoting his time and resources to oust Republicans he's deemed unsupportive of his agenda. Last month, he helped unseat 5 Indiana state senators who opposed his redistricting push. And tomorrow, Trump-backed challenger Ed Gallerin will look to defeat Congressman Tom Massie of Kentucky, whose vote against Trump's big, beautiful bill and his efforts to force the release of the Epstein files made him a top Trump target. The president blasting Massie in a flurry of social media posts in recent days is weak and obstructionist, but the congressman largely brushing off his criticism.
Every time he tweets about me, it's good for, some money coming in because people don't like that. But you can tell that I'm ahead in the polls and they're desperate. That's why they're sending the Secretary of War to my district tomorrow. That's why the president's losing sleep and tweeting about this.
Now, at the same time, the president's allies defending his efforts to oust Republicans he deems insufficiently loyal. Take a listen.
This is the president's party. When he endorses, he wins.
Bill Cassidy's lost because he tried to destroy Trump. Massie's going to lose because he's trying to destroy the agenda. You can disagree with President Trump, but if you try to destroy him, you're going to lose because this is the party of Donald Trump.
But while the president's grip on his party remains strong, he is losing his grip on the broader electorate. 2 recent polls show his approval rating significantly underwater, largely driven by disapproval over his handling of the cost of living and the war in Iran. And when it comes to who voters say they plan to vote for in November, a majority choose the Democratic candidate by an 11-point margin. Joining me now to talk more about this, senior national political reporter Sahil Kapur. He's on Capitol Hill. And our Capitol Hill correspondent Julie Tsirkin is on the ground in Kentucky ahead of tomorrow's election. Sahil, let's start with you. Senator Cassidy, could he become a wild card here? He now has 7 months left of his term. Could we see an unrestrained Cassidy on Capitol Hill, and could that be a problem for the president's agenda?
Well, Ryan, there are a lot of people up here asking that exact question. There are certain kinds of retiring Republicans who just kind of go quietly, who may have their issues with Trump, but hit the mute button on them. I think Senator Joni Ernst comes to mind there. Then there are others who are very much unrestrained, who do exactly what they want and say what they please. Senator Thom Tillis comes to mind. There are a couple of things that Bill Cassidy said in his concession speech that make me think he might be the latter, more on the unleashed page. Apart from what you said, he had a line about how sometimes democracy doesn't turn out the way you want. You don't pout, whine, you don't claim the election was stolen. His crowd knew exactly what he was talking about there. He also said he's not bothered by insults online because people of character and integrity don't do that. Again, read into that what you will. Pretty clear to me what he was talking about. Cassidy, unlike Tillis, is the chair of the HELP Committee, which oversees HHS. We've seen the palpable discomfort he's had with RFK over vaccines, even though he did vote for RFK. There's no permanent Surgeon General right now. There's no permanent FDA commissioner. all of these kind of nominees would go through Cassidy. So he would have a very real amount of influence, significant influence over Trump's agenda if he chooses to use it.
Yeah. And, it's interesting, Sahil, because the Republican base in these primaries is clearly more happy with Trump. But I wonder how Republican leadership views all of this. Are they concerned that tilting the president tilting the party, I should say, toward the president, especially a president who's so significantly underwater in his approval rating, could hurt the broader Republican Party in the upcoming midterms?
It's kind of a moot point, Ryan, as far as my conversations with Republicans go. They know that there's no real distinguishing yourself from Trump in this party. He's going to define the vast majority of candidates. There are very few of them who have a brand of their own. You can probably count them on fingers on one hand. Senator Susan Collins in Maine is one example. But the vast majority of Republicans are going to rise and fall with Trump, and that's where the nervousness comes from. What Republicans do want is for Trump to get his approval rating up. They want the economy to improve. They want his numbers on the economy to improve. They want gas prices to come down. And some of them I've talked to, they think the war in Iran needs to end by August. The Strait of Hormuz needs to open and return to status quo ante by August in order for this to happen ahead of the midterm. So that's the attitude. They saw what happened in the first term, where Trump's fortunes basically determined the rest of the party's fortunes. And very little can happen, I think, between now and the midterms to save Republicans from significant defeats up and down the ballot unless Trump's ratings improve.
Yeah, I wonder if August may even be too late for some of these Republicans. Let's turn now to NBC's Kelly O'Donnell, who joins us now. She is outside the White House. Kelly, I have to imagine the president feels pretty good about the results over the weekend. What's his mood heading into tomorrow? Does he feel bolstered by these results in Louisiana, and does he feel confident Tom Massie's going down?
Well, certainly the president likes to exert his influence, his power over the party, to remind Republicans running for office that the president has a deep connection with at least his base and the MAGA voters who are the most likely to turn out in these midterm primaries, which is really a small subset of the overall available electorate. That's the nature of primaries. So the president has that lever and he wields it. Certainly he will be counting all of the outcomes, as he often does, usually uses his social media to boast about when he has that kind of victory. And we've often already seen him hinting about other members of the Republican conference in the House who might be subject to his sort of electoral fury. Lauren Boebert comes to mind. So with Thomas Massie, the president has long been very clear that he is at odds with Massie over substantive issues. And Massie has held tough. And as you have noted, Ryan, he may be able to weather this simply by virtue of his long standing in his own community. But at the same time, the president's finger on the scale here is a considerable one. It's actually kind of a big thumb on the scale. And the president, we will likely hear from him later this afternoon. He has one planned event unrelated to these matters. But we have seen him like to opine about these things when he has something that he thinks is working in his favor.
Yeah, you mentioned that big thumb to the tune of $30 million. That's going to be the most expensive House primary in American history to replace a Republican with another Republican that votes with the president 90% of the time. And with that in mind, Kelly, I have to wonder, is there anybody inside the White House that's a little nervous that the president is focusing on these Republican primaries, especially when he is dealing with a war, he's dealing with this negative polling that we've talked about, and he's dealing with inflation on the rise?
We've certainly seen how the president, based on that polling, is in a problematic place with the American people overall. And certainly in the White House, they are sensitive to what happens if Democrats win control of one or both of the chambers in November. That is going to, if it were to happen, is going to have enormous impact on the Trump agenda and how the White House functions. So there is a lot on the line. We've also seen how the president is not always working in his own self-interest or the party's self-interest when there are these personal issues, a vendetta, if you will, a political score to settle with a given Republican in the playing field. The president sometimes acts on that more than the long-term needs of his party and of governance for the months to come. So as you've talked about, with Senator Cassidy, he could now be a real thorn for the president. The margin in the House so limited, that could be problematic. And as you talked about, the drain of resources that could be used in other races where they need to defend a Senate seat or try to expand the map somewhere. All of those kinds of considerations come into play. Those don't tend to be the things that the president thinks about first and foremost.
Yeah, great stuff, Kelly. Let's go to the ground now in Kentucky and get a vibe for what's happening there. Julie, you're standing by. You've talked to Congressman Massie quite a bit over the past week or two. He seems pretty optimistic about his chances. He is giving an air of confidence that he could win tomorrow's primary. Does that say something about the limits of the president's power, or are Massie and his district unique?
I mean, look, Massie is characteristically unbothered when it comes to President Trump or anyone else who attacks him for that matter. But this district, Kentucky's 4th congressional district, is really unique. The president has had a winning streak in Indiana, as you mentioned, with Cassidy. But this area is different. Rand Paul, the libertarian, hails from the state as well. I've talked to a number of voters, both today and back in March when the president came here to hold an event and essentially parade Ed Gilchrist, his handpicked candidate that is pretty much a political unknown in this area, around. Massie feels pretty confident even heading into tomorrow because people here don't want to be told what to do. I just talked to somebody in the bar behind me who said he voted for Trump. He supports Trump. This district is as Republican and as Trump supporting as you can get, especially in this state. And yet he said he does not like the fact that the president is putting so much pressure on people to vote for Massie's opponent or pretty much anywhere in this country. He doesn't like what he's seeing because of that. So I do wonder if it could backfire on the president down the line in the midterms in the next few years as well. But certainly Massie's still feeling kind of confident, although I do think that him slipping in the polls certainly has his attention as well. And you just can't get past that exorbitant number of money that has been spent in this race, mostly on negative ads against Massie.
And, you know, it's interesting, Julie, because one of the things Tom Massie prides himself on is being his own man, regardless of what party affiliation he has, which is, I think, a stark contrast with Ed Gilchrist, who is the president's hand-picked candidate here. How closely is he sticking to the president in this race?
Like glue. I remember at that March event that I was at, it was in Hebron, Kentucky as well. It's supposed to be this economic-focused event, touting the One Big Beautiful Bill, the tax provisions in that Massie voted against. He brought Ed Gilchrist on the stage, Trump did, and he essentially said, I want someone with a warm body. That's how he introduced Gilchrist to the crowd. That's exactly what he looked for, a yes man. Take a listen to what Gilchrist had to say today.
He has blocked the president's attempt to unleash our economy, reduce taxes, build the border wall, restore national security. He even joined ranks with the radical Democrats to restrict the president's responsibilities as a commander-in-chief with what's going on in the Mideast now. At every turn, he has betrayed us.
Now, Gilchrist had an event today with Secretary Hegseth. He has a tele-rally later tonight with the president. And someone I talked to in the bar behind me told me that's all they really see him doing. He's not holding many community events. He has not participated in any debates. He has not granted us an interview either, Ryan.
Okay, Julie Tsirkin on the ground in Kentucky. We'll have to see what happens. Sahil Kapur on Capitol Hill. Kelly O'Donnell at the White House. Thank you all. Kentucky, of course, just one of a half dozen states holding primary elections tomorrow, including Georgia, where 3 Republicans are facing off for the chance to challenge Democratic Senator Jon Ossoff in November. President Trump has not weighed in on this race, but Governor Brian Kemp, who's popular there, has thrown his support behind former football coach Derek Dooley. He's joining him on the campaign trail in Marietta earlier today. Joining me now from Atlanta is NBC News national correspondent Aaron Gilchrist. So, Aaron, let's start there. As we mentioned, Dooley has the governor's support, but what's the case that he's making to voters?
You know, if you are big into college football, Ryan, you know the name Derek Dooley. You know the name Dooley for sure. But if you're not, you may not know him. And he really is trying to play that up, saying that he is a political outsider when it comes to particularly this Senate race and when it comes to this Republican primary that we're seeing here in Georgia that will play out tomorrow and then also likely into a runoff election. But he's tried to present himself as the political outsider who can go to Washington and lead differently without any sort of baggage that may come with folks who've been in Washington for a while. He says that he's the one who can stay on offense against Jon Ossoff, the sitting senator from Georgia who's up for re-election in November. I want you to hear a little bit of what we heard from Dooley earlier today as he's been sort of crisscrossing the state in this last day of campaigning, as the other candidates have been doing. But we talked to him earlier today about sort of how he's different and what he would do differently in Washington. Listen.
If you want change, it always starts at the top with leadership. And it's time we start sending a different kind of leader up to D.C., people with common sense, people that share our values here in Georgia, but most importantly, they're going up there for the right reasons. and that's to work with others to deliver results for you. I'm really not trying to win an election just because Governor Kemp says vote for Dooley or President Trump says vote for Dooley. I told you, my number one goal was to earn it the right way. That's what my focus has been.
Now, the last part of the answer you heard there was after I asked Dooley about not getting an endorsement from President Trump. I asked him whether he was courting that endorsement and if he understood the reality that we've seen here in Georgia as we've been moving around the state for different elections, and that is that Republican voters in this state are listening to, are watching for what President Trump wants to do. And so we know that we've heard from people who say that they either are, you think Georgia 14, the special election that was held for Marjorie Taylor Greene's old seat, where we heard voters say that they were following President Trump's lead in supporting Clay Fuller. We asked people who didn't know Clay Fuller why they were going to vote for him, and he said, oh, well, I don't know anything about him, but President Trump supports him, and so that's who I'm going to support. And that's something that we've heard over and over again as we've talked to Republican voters here in Georgia, Ryan. So it's something that Dooley is aware of, and it's something that he seems to suggest is not going to be a big deal for him because he's carrying a message of work with President Trump, but for the people of Georgia. That's a refrain we've heard over and over again from him.
Okay, we'll have to see how these results look tomorrow night. Aaron Gilchrist, thank you for being there on the ground.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.